Okay, welcome to Psych 235, Child Psychology. Today, we're continuing our chapter on adolescence, biosocial development. So we talked before about hormones, and we talked about the start of puberty. We talked about, lots of things, growth and weight gain and all those different things. Today, we're continuing with brain development, and we'll get into other things in a moment. Okay, so let's get started. So brain development during adolescence. Well, the brain is always developing, right? Even before you're born, the brain is developing and continues to develop, and it's not fully actually developed until according to some research, until maybe your late teens. Some research has suggested your early 20s. So what's happening with your brain during this time, during adolescence? Well, there's the limbic system. If you recall, the limbic system is the part of the brain basically that is involved with fear and emotional responses. It's a primitive part of the brain. Okay. Some have called it the part of the reptilian brain, right? It's a primitive part of the brain that's involved with fear and emotion. The limbic system actually matures or develops before the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is the very front of your brain, like right behind your forehead, right around there. It's involved with planning, right? Deciding what you're going to do when and in what order, right? Planning, controlling your emotions, organizing your behavior, organizing your thoughts. It's involved with self-control. It's involved with the ability to focus, right? And those things are very important for any human being, especially one that is an adolescent, right? Or if you're going to function more like an adult, you need your prefrontal cortex, to be more fully developed. Okay, so because the limbic system is is ahead in terms of development of the prefrontal cortex, adolescent behavior is going to be a bit more emotional. Okay, now the limbic system includes things like the amygdala, which activates quick emotional responses. Remember, the amygdala is involved with basically fear and aggression. So the sudden anger, joy, fear, despair that adolescents feel or may feel is because of the amygdala. Okay, sex, drugs, loud music greatly appeal to adolescents, right? Adolescents love to party, right? They love to feel good. They really get into that music, right? They get very bummed out when somebody doesn't like their hairstyle or says something mean about the clothes they're wearing, right? They're very emotional. This is because of the limbic system, okay? And the amygdala is part of that. That's involved with aggression and fear, which, fear, anger, despair, right? Those kind of things, and aggression, right? Those kind of things are all related to negative emotions, but apparently joy as well, okay? And that explains the functioning of adolescents, right, during this time, why they are so emotional, so moody. Strong emotional experience interferes with careful thought and planning. This extremely emotional behavior interferes with your ability to basically to focus, okay, to pay attention, to plan, okay, to control your emotions. So it's like the emotional part of your brain is stronger than the more rational part of your brain during adolescence. And that explains why adolescents do all sorts of crazy things and they engage in all sorts of risky behaviors. Let's keep going. There are also, and by the way, we'll talk about this risky behavior and things like that when we talk about psychological development. That'll come up again. Okay, right now we're just talking about the brain. During adolescence, many will also have diet deficiencies. A lot of adolescents don't eat the right kinds of things. A study in 2015 showed that only 16% of U.S. high schoolers actually ate the recommended 3 or more daily vegetable servings. They don't want to eat their vegetables so much, right? There's deficiencies in iron. They don't get enough iron. A lot of them don't get enough calcium, okay? Don't get enough zinc and other minerals. Iron you get from eating things that are called like legumes, right? Like, lentils, beans and liver and, liver's not a legume, but things like that. Calcium, of course, you get from drinking milk, eating cheese. Now, adolescents will eat plenty of cheese and, because of pizza and things like that, but they don't drink a lot of milk. They drink a lot of sugary drinks instead. They don't get enough zinc. I forget where zinc comes from, but if you eat a balanced diet, you would get those things. These are causes for concern because these things are needed for bone and muscle growth, right? Adolescents are growing very rapidly, developing very rapidly, and they need all these things. These nutritional deficiencies results from the food choices that adolescents make, right? Or are allowed to make. They eat a lot of junk food, okay? They love that stuff, right? Burgers and fries and pizza and those sugary drinks and those milkshakes, right? That's what adolescents love to eat. They're not into really healthy eating. And, you know, their bodies are young and most of them are still slim and most of them still look good because they're young, right? But these food choices aren't very good. They're missing many nutrients, a bunch of empty calories. They get a lot of fat, a lot of salt, a lot of sugar from the food choices they make. And if they continue with these food choices when they're older, they will end up overweight and obese. And we talked about that before, but they don't make very good food choices, right? That's what they like to eat, and often parents allow this stuff, right? And we should emphasize to our adolescents, right, our teenagers, that they need to follow a healthy diet, and we need to model that for them. They need to get that at home, and we need to tell them about what this, junk food is doing to them. And they may not see it now, but they'll see it later on, the damage that this is going to do. Hopefully they change their habits, before it gets too bad. All right, let's keep going. More about nutrition. Now, there are those that don't eat much food at all. And those people are said to suffer from what we call anorexia nervosa, okay? This could have been in the psychological part of adolescence, the psychological chapter, but it's here too because it's biological as well. We all know what anorexia is. It's basically self-starvation. It's when people refuse to eat adequate amounts of food. Okay, usually it involves self-starvation. They just don't eat enough, or they eat very little. Some don't eat much at all. Some of them will also exercise excessively. They'll exercise thinking that they need to lose weight. And if you've seen anorexics, they're actually extremely thin. Okay, they look like skeletons. They don't need to exercise and burn off more calories. Okay, what they need to do is eat more so their body gets the proper nutrients. Okay. They risk dying, actually. Their internal organs are deprived of nourishment, and they can actually starve to death. And some of them do. About 5 to 20% is what it says there at the end of the slide there. About 5 to 20% starve to death, depending on which study you look at. It is a big problem, and I actually know somebody who starved to death, okay? It's a very sad thing, and this person was in denial. And, it's something that happens. We need to be aware of. It's something that when you see something like this and you care about this person, you need to have an intervention, right? You need to confront this person and hopefully get this person to change their behavior. It is a psychological disorder, actually, but it has a lot to do with biological stuff. Anorexics refuse to maintain 85% of their normal body weight. So not only are they thin, they are below normal body weight. Okay, so they're excessively thin. Their BMI is 18 or lower. At about 18 and a half, right around 19 is where normal body weight begins. And by normal, I mean you're here, with 18.5, 19, you're on the thin side, right? You're thin, but you're still in the normal range. Below that, you're not even in the normal range anymore. Anorexics are below that. And many of them are far below that, okay? They have an intense fear of gaining weight. They think gaining weight is the end of the world, that they would rather die rather than gain weight, and a lot of them do die, okay? They have disturbed body perception and denial of the problem. The disturbed body perception has to do with the fact that they look at themselves in the mirror and they see somebody heavier. They think they're overweight. And if you know someone who's anorexic and you look at them, they look like skeletons to you, but to them, to themselves, they look like they're overweight and they want to continue losing weight, right? They actually have, it's a disturbed body perception. They don't see reality, okay? In adolescents and adult females, there's also lack of menstruation. When you become so anorexic, or you basically are so thin that you don't even get your period anymore, when you're a female, right? And it's not because you're older and going through menopause, but you're in this range, right, where you would normally get your period. When you're so thin that you don't get your period, right, your body is telling you that you're not even healthy enough to reproduce. you're extremely unhealthy. Okay, it's spreading worldwide, especially in urban areas. Why is it spreading? Well, because what we see in the media, in the movies, we see people that are supposed to be sexy and good looking, and they're all excessively thin. We see it on billboards. We see it on the internet. We see it everywhere. This is part of basically, Western culture, American culture that's spreading around the world, right? The movies are shown everywhere now. The commercials for products and all that stuff. You almost always see people who are supposed to be young and good looking and desirable, and the women are always really thin. That is starting to change a little bit. You are starting to see billboards and commercials with more normal looking women that are not so skinny, but you only see usually like one out of like 5 or something like that. Or even in sitcoms and shows on TV or in movies, you'll see a few of them now that are normal, right? Or maybe even overweight. So it's starting to change. But the vast majority of people, and especially the popular ones, especially the big celebrities, the big stars, are always excessively thin. And they're all anorexic. They're all in that range. They are not normal body weight. And you have to keep in mind that when you're on TV, TV actually makes you look heavier. And so if these women look thin on TV, can you imagine how thin they actually are in real life? They're excessively thin. And this is what we're telling adolescent females that they should look like if they want to be desirable. That's the message that we're sending to people in the US, people in Europe, and even around the world now, even in Latin America and Africa and Asia. American culture is very popular and it's spreading around the world, right? The TVs, the movies, the commercials, the products, everything. Okay, and it's a big problem. It also happens in men, but for a smaller percentage of men. All right. But men usually have the opposite problem, by the way. They actually are overweight and they think that they're actually normal weight. Okay. Because men, there's a different perception of men, that men are supposed to be big and strong. And a lot of them are overweight and just say, well, I'm just a big burly man. And like, no, you're overweight. Okay. So men actually have the opposite problem, but there are some men who are also anorexic. Okay. Another problem that's to do with nutrition, that starts during adolescence. By the way, anorexia starts during adolescence because that's when body image becomes important, during adolescence. Before that, they didn't really care too much about their body image. But during adolescence, it becomes a key thing, right? You want to fit in, you want to look good, and that continues. And that's when adolescence starts. Another problem that's to do with nutrition during adolescence, that starts during adolescence, is called bulimia nervosa, or just bulimia. Again, you've all probably heard of this. This is when there is both binge eating and purging. The binge eating is basically when the individual eats like a lot of food in one sitting. Okay, so the binges include consuming thousands of calories. So maybe they go to McDonald's and they might eat like 3 Big Macs, 2 large fries, 3 milkshakes or something like that, and they'll get thousands of calories. Like 10,000 calories in one sitting, or maybe not that much, but they'll eat thousands of calories in one sitting. Okay, keep in mind that all you need to do is eat 1 Big Mac, 1 large fries, and 1 sugary drink for you to get like 3,000 calories at McDonald's. Okay, just one. That's how bad that food is. Okay, that one meal gives you more calories than you should have in the whole day. That's how fattening that food is. But they consume thousands of calories at a time, and then they feel guilty about it, and they purge themselves. Purging involves basically usually vomiting, making themselves vomit, throwing up the food so that they don't absorb it. They may also do things like inducing diarrhea, give themselves things using laxatives, diuretics, things that will make them get diarrhea. So basically, they can lose weight that way. But they lose a bunch of water as well. So basically, they're trying to get thin or stay thin by vomiting or making themselves get a bunch of diarrhea, things like that. It's not healthy, but I want to point out that this sounds like bulimics may be thin because of this, but they're not. Bulimics can actually, they can actually be overweight, they can be obese, they can be normal weight. Some of them are anorexic. Some of them are both anorexic and bulimic. Research has shown that about 6.5% of girls, about 2.5% of boys use these methods to lose weight. They purge themselves, they make themselves vomit, which is very unhealthy. Now, in order for you to be considered bulimic, right, you must you must have binging and purging for at least once a week for 3 months. So doing it one time here and there, you're not really considered bulimic, right? According to the DSM, okay? You must do it at least once a week for 3 months. That would mean that you've done it maybe like 12 times, 12 weeks in a row or something like that. That means that there's a pattern, right? You are bulimic. Okay, 1 to 3% of women are usually bulimic. Percentages are smaller in men. People who are bulimic will tend to have gastrointestinal problems, because they don't consume enough food, and there's also the acid from the vomiting, so they'll have stomach problems, and they're more likely to suffer cardiac arrest. Basically, they're more likely to die of a heart attack. And again, I know someone who died from this. Okay, this is really sad, but this happens. Okay, and it's a very dangerous thing to be doing, and I'll tell you other things that bulimia does. Okay, if you are bulimic and you eat food like this, right? You eat a lot of food and then you make yourself throw it up. That's usually what they do. Okay, because of the acid, when you throw up, after a while, your teeth will begin to rot. And your hair will begin to fall out after a while because you're not getting enough protein. So you'll be combing your hair, and all of a sudden a big chunk will just fall right out. I know someone this happened to, okay? And when she started telling me about her hair falling out, and then it all made sense, I realized that she was bulimic because I had gone out with this person. I've gone out to eat with her. And whenever we went out to eat, she would eat, and then she would excuse herself to go to the ladies' room. And she'd go there, and she'd take a while, and then she'd come back. And I noticed several times that her breath smelled really bad afterward. And now I realize that she was throwing up, right? When she told me her hair was falling out, I put it together, right? She's been throwing up. That's why her breath smells bad. That's, she's bulimic. That's why her hair's falling out, right? It's a very bad thing. You don't want to do this. Okay. It's just an unhealthy thing to do, and it starts during adolescence. Let's talk about other stuff that's also interesting. Let's talk about sexual activity, which is something that, again, can start during adolescence. For some, it starts earlier, and that's not healthy, right? And it's just not good. But sexual activity during adolescence also comes with its problems. Okay. Sexual impulses are mostly toward partners of about the same sex. Okay. During adolescence, yes, there are these sexual urges that emerge, because of puberty and hormones and things like that. It's something that happens. Okay. They're going to have these sexual urges, and eventually they're going to want to start to have sex. And as a parent, your job is to slow them down because they're not ready. Okay, remember, they may start adolescence as early as 11, around 12 is around the average for girls, right? They're not ready. Okay, no way are they ready. Okay, but even a couple of years later, they're still not ready. Okay. Research shows that, adolescent girls are more interested in the depth of romance than boys. Girls basically have this idealistic way of looking at relationships, where they're going to fall in love and, they're all going to live happily ever after, things like that. Boys are, I'm not saying that boys don't care about that stuff, but boys care a lot more about physical stuff, about the way the girl looks and things like that, right? They have higher levels of testosterone that makes them more interested in the actual physical aspect of sex, and more likely to basically to focus on those things. Okay. It's just, there are some differences from the beginning. For most of the 20th century, there's been an increasing number of adolescents that are becoming sexually active. We have more and more adolescents that are becoming sexually active. Okay. It wasn't so much of a problem in the past because people got married earlier. Okay. They got married right out of high school, and, they didn't become sexually active that early. And then by the time they did, they were basically ready to get married. Okay. That's what happened back then. So more people are becoming sexually active, but the trend reversed in 1990, where 51% of adolescents reported that they have had sex in 2005. Okay. In 1990s when it started to reverse. It started to go down supposedly, and only about half reported that they have had sex in 2005. You have to remember though that this research is done with surveys. Okay, They ask adolescents about, things of a sexual nature, whether they've had sex, whether they've done this or that, right? And they have found some interesting things. But there's also differences among ethnicities. About 68%, a little bit more than 2/3 of African Americans reported that they have had sex, as adolescents. Latinos are about half, they're about average. And white people are a little bit, 43%. I don't have a number there for Asians, but Asians would be the lowest. Asians are a bit more restrained when it comes to having sex. They start having sex later. They listen to their parents more. Their parents are more, more strict. Okay, so but it does vary by ethnicity. And keep in mind that this is, like I said, this is done with surveys. So the extent to which adolescents are willing to say they've had sex or not, and how appropriate it is for their culture, will impact the percentages that you see. And it's probably just more acceptable to say you've had sex for certain groups than others. So there you see sexual activity for males and females, how the trend has kind of reversed, and it has been going down. The number of adolescents that are, this is 9th to 12th graders. So remember that, I don't know if you guys are aware, but it wasn't too long ago that high school was considered, no, actually, 9th to 12th grade is, yes, those are the current high school years, right? Yes, 9th to 12th grade. When I went to high school actually started in 10th grade. Okay, it was 3 years, 10th, 11th, and 12th. Now there's an extra year. Now there's 9, 10, 11, and 12. So you can see how the percentage of them that reported having sex has been going down. And we have to think about that. Is it because less of them are having sex, or is it because we are aware of this now, and there's a kind of a movement, a campaign to kind of slow this down, and maybe they're saying, yes, I agree with you, or yes, I'm behaving myself. Are they really doing this? That's something we have to think about, because it's done with surveys. It's hard to get adolescents to change their behavior, so I'm not sure. They may just be responding to what we want to hear, is what I'm saying, right? But there have been some movements to slow down the rate at which adolescents are having sex, because they're not ready yet. And of course, sexual behavior is risky, okay, especially for adolescents. For adolescents, it's very risky, and I'll mention why in a moment. But of course, there are sexually transmitted infections. We used to call them STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. Now they're called sexually transmitted infections, because some of these are actually infections and not diseases. Okay, sexually active teens have high rates of STIs, high rates of sexually transmitted infections. Okay, they're very likely to get chlamydia. Chlamydia is the most common sexually transmitted infection. Okay, and if left untreated, it can cause infertility. Luckily, chlamydia can be treated, I believe, with antibiotics. And then there's the human papillomavirus, right? HPV, okay, which raises the chance of uterine cancer if it's not treated. Now, there is actually a vaccine now for HPV, but some parents don't want their kids to take it, to get this vaccine, because they think it's somehow going to encourage teenagers to have sex. But think about that, right? Does HPV to you, does that scream sex, right? You're going to get an HPV vaccine. Does that somehow tell you that has somehow something to do with sex? Most adolescents will have no clue. If they were to get this vaccine and they're told it's an HPV vaccine, they don't have to tell them what vaccine it is, but they would have no clue. It's not going to make them have sex earlier, okay? You might as well have your kids protected and get the HPV vaccine. Of course, there's also HIV, which can lead to AIDS. And if left untreated, of course, that can cause death. Luckily, nowadays, there are some very good treatments for HIV. And there are treatments that are good enough so that the AIDS might never develop. And AIDS is what is actually dangerous. AIDS stands for immunodeficiency syndrome, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, I believe, right? HIV is when you're first, you have the virus, right? The human immunodeficiency virus, right? Now, when it turns into AIDS is when it can become deadly. But there's very good drugs nowadays that can prevent that from happening, and people can live long, full lives, even while being HIV positive. So that's the good news. The bad news is usually you have to have pretty good health care, right, to get treatment for that. It's very expensive, okay? If you have to pay for it yourself, it would probably cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's how expensive it is. But you don't have to die from AIDS anymore. But people still die around the world from AIDS because, of course, other countries don't have the, the access to healthcare that we do here. And I'll remind you again that there are people trying to fight, right, to reduce access to healthcare, and that's really bad. Okay, everyone should have healthcare. It doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich or whatever it is, whether you're employed or not. It's just the way. It's just the right thing to do. Okay. Ages 15 to 24 are very risky in terms of sexual activity. About 1/4 of those that are ages 15 to 24 make up about 1/4 of those that are sexually active. So yeah, there's a bunch of adults having sex too. The young people, they make up about 1/4 of the people who are having sex, but they make up about half of the STI cases. They account for half of the sexually transmitted infections out there. So the point is that basically these infections and diseases are very common in sexually active adolescents. Okay, and that's bad. Okay, what that tells us is because they make up a smaller percentage of those that are actually having sex, but they make up half the cases of these sexually transmitted infections, and that tells us that yes, they're having sex, but they're also having a lot of unprotected sex and are spreading these diseases and infections. Those under 16 years of age are very likely to contract a sexually transmitted infection if they should have sex, because they engage in risky behaviors. They don't always protect themselves. Okay, they're less likely to seek immediate treatment and tell their partner. They're less likely to seek treatment because they're embarrassed or they don't want their parents to know, right? And they're less likely to even tell their partner that they're having sex with, that they've contracted something, and that they should get themselves checked out also. They're embarrassed. They don't want to tell people. They don't want to tell their parents. This is a health issue, okay? And it's risky behavior for those under 16 years of age to be. It's just risky for them to be having sex because they don't always know how to about doing it the right way, okay? And by the right way, I mean, in a responsible way where they're protected from both pregnancy and and sexually transmitted infections. In the U.S., 46% of senior girls use the condom during the last time they had sex. According to a survey, they were asked, right, the last time you had sex, did you use a condom? Less than half of them said they used the condom. And that number, by the way, is probably higher than reality because a lot of them would say that they did just out of embarrassment when maybe they did not. But the point is that most of them are having unprotected sex, and that's really bad. Okay, it's for spreading these infections. There's other reasons why you don't want adolescents to start having sex too early. Okay, hazards related to adolescent sexual activity. There's a correlation of early sex with depression, drug abuse, and lifelong problems. Those that basically start having sex earlier, those things are usually associated with other problems. Okay, it doesn't mean that having sex earlier leads to depression, leads to drug use or lifelong problems. It could be the other way around, that those that have these problems are more likely to have sex earlier. But anyway, there's a correlation. These things kind of go together. Those that have more problems are more likely to start having sex earlier, all right, to put it one way. Absence of the partner for raising a child. If you get pregnant as an adolescent and you have that child, guess what? You're probably not going to have that other partner, right, help you raise that child. That other person is an adolescent. That person is not ready to be a father. Right? The female has the child and is going to probably raise the child. The other person you had sex with, a lot of times that's someone that you're not going to end up marrying. It just doesn't happen that much that your high school sweetheart ends up being the one you married. That doesn't happen that much anymore. You're more likely to not end up together, and you're going to end up raising this child on your own for the most part. Hopefully you have your parents help you out, right? But it's not a good start, okay, to your, to your adolescence or to your, your later adolescent years, whenever it does happen, okay. There's increased complexity and expenses related to parenting, fewer family helpers. Yeah, I mean, it's expensive to raise kids, and it complicates your life. It makes your life so much more difficult. You're just more likely to have, problems at school, doing well, because it's just you have to raise this child now. Fewer family helpers. It's hard to raise a child on your own. If you have parents who will help you, right, that's a good thing. Others that will help you. But either way, it's it's a problem. You'll be better off later on, right? If you have kids later when you're ready, right? And and you have a good job, and you have you're actually married, and you have all the support that you need. You may not have that support when you're younger. Although I will tell you that, at least from the Latino perspective, that parents usually help out. Okay, more likely to encounter we're more likely to encounter STIs and dangerous STIs, sexually transmitted infections, because as an adolescent, like I said, you're less likely to protect yourself. You're less likely to go about things responsibly. And why is that? It's because of what we talked about before. Adolescents are very emotional, okay? Very emotional, and they engage in risky behavior, right? The limbic system, the so-called emotional part of the brain is well developed, so they're very emotional, right? And not so careful when it comes to planning, okay, and controlling themselves. And that leads to risky behavior and risky sex. And that usually means unprotected sex and, sexually transmitted infections. Teenage pregnancy is a big problem, okay? I remember when I was growing up, when I was a kid, teenage pregnancies were rare, okay? When somebody, got pregnant as a teenager, everyone would be so surprised and like, oh my God, what happened? How can this happen? And it was like a big deal, right? And then by the time I became an adult, it was like a common thing. It happened all the time. And nowadays, nobody is surprised anymore when a teenager gets pregnant. It happens a lot, okay? Girls that get pregnant within 1 or 2 years after menarche risk complications during pregnancy. Those that get pregnant very early on after puberty, they're more likely to have problems. And keep in mind that for adolescent girls, right, the average is about 12. So we're talking about those that get pregnant like at 13, 14. Okay, if they got pregnant at 13, 14, when did they start having sex? Right? Those that got pregnant at 13 were already having sex at 12. Think about that, right? That is not right. Or those that are 14 were having sex at 13. That is way, way too young to be having sex. And you know what the messed up thing is? You know what the bad thing really is about this? A lot of these teenage girls who get pregnant end up getting pregnant by guys who are actually much older than them. We're talking about basically older men taking advantage of young girls. A lot of that is what is happening, okay? You want to protect your teens, right, from those older men who know what they're doing, right? They know how to seduce these girls, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't let them have friends and date and things like that, but they should be with people their age, because the people their age are kind of clueless. Guys that are 13, 14 years of age, they don't know, right, how to seduce someone, how to get sex. So those are going to be more innocent relationships, right? But these older men, they know what they're doing, okay? So if you get pregnant with 1 or 2 years after starting puberty, right? We're talking 13, 14 years of age, you're more risk for having a spontaneous abortion, right? Just losing, the embryo or the fetus, usually at the embryonic stage. More a risk of high blood pressure, having a stillbirth where you give birth to a child that isn't alive. You're more likely to have a C-section. Your body's not even ready, right, to deliver this child. Child is more likely to have low birth weight as well. Your body just isn't ready. The uterus and the body functioning are not yet mature. The body's adjusting to new hormones. Your body's still developing. And now you have these, you have adolescent hormones because your body's developing. And then there's other hormones that have to do with the developing embryo and infant inside your body that are also swirling around there, right? So, it's not a good situation. Your body's adjusting to your own hormones, and now it has to contend with hormones from the developing fetus. Teenage mothers are sicker as adults. They don't live as long, but not because they were teenage mothers, but for economic reasons. When you become a teenage mother, life is going to be tougher. You're less likely to finish school. You're less likely to get a good job. And for the most part, life is going to be tough for you. Okay. It doesn't mean that it can't turn out okay. I know plenty of people, and I've had plenty of students that are in school doing well. And yes, they were teenage mothers. They have kids. They're raising kids, and they're doing well because they want to be responsible. Okay. And they want to give themselves and their kids a good future. But the reality is that it's just harder, okay, to get through school and college and do all the things you need to do while you're raising a child Who's going to take care of the child while you go to school, while you go to work, while you do all these things, right? If you have help, that's good, but it just makes life so much harder, and life is already difficult, okay? Birth complications are are not more common after 16, 19 years of age. By the time you're 16, 19, your body can handle that pregnancy, and you're not likely to have many complications. But when you're younger than that, it's a problem. And it's just a sad thing to know that, yes, there are plenty of girls giving birth at 13, 14, 15 years of age. As a matter of fact, I've had students in my classes, one of them that was actually a nurse, and she was taking my class, and she says she's shocked by the fact that there's basically 14-year-old girls that she basically helps deliver. I mean, 14-year-old girls that are giving birth, and that she's involved with that, helping deliver those babies. She's just shocked at how young these girls are when they're giving birth. In our valley right here, I'm not talking about elsewhere, okay? It happens a lot here and in other places as well. More about teenage pregnancies. Teenage pregnancy, as I told you guys before, it slows educational achievement. It's just harder to get through school, right? Even high school, and then go on to college, right? It's just going to be that much more difficult. It's very hard already as it is, and now you got to raise a child. It's hard, okay? It's hard to raise a child even when you already have a good job and you're married and you have somebody else to help you out. I mean, me and my wife raising kids, it's difficult, and we argue a lot, and there's problems. Can you imagine if you're a teenage mother on your own, so to speak, trying to get through school, and now you need a job too, right? It depends on how much help you have, right? If you have parents who help you out a lot and they can't provide a lot of help, versus if you're poor and they can't help you much, and or they kick you out of the house because you got pregnant or whatever it is, and then you have to now raise this child on your own. It's harder to get employment, right? You have this child to take care of, right? Who's going to take care of your kid while you go to work, right? Harder for you to get married. That's the sad reality, is that you're unlikely to end up with the person who got you pregnant. That's the reality, right? You got pregnant young. You think that 16-year-old is going to marry you, right? Or whenever you got pregnant at 15 or whenever that is, right? No, chances are you're not going to end up with that person. You're still growing, developing, you're still maturing, and you're probably going to find that that person isn't even right for you. There are some people who do marry their high school sweetheart. That still happens, but most of the time that doesn't happen anymore, okay? Even if you don't get pregnant, you're going to go through relationships. You're going to get your heart broken several times before you find the one. And if you get pregnant, it's going to be that much harder for you to find the one, or to actually get married, right? And find someone who's going to commit to you, because they got to commit to you and your child now. And it's not their kid. And here's the truth. Guys want someone that hasn't had kids. They want to marry someone like that, someone who's going to have their kids. They don't want to be raising somebody else's kids. Now, there's plenty of guys out there, good guys that, will love you enough to, also, still marry you and stuff like that, because they love you, and they'll still marry you, even and help raise a child that isn't theirs, right? And become their stepdaddy or whatever it is. But it's just harder. There's plenty of guys who will date you and have sex with you and stuff like that. But they'll move on, usually to somebody else. That's the reality, okay? When you get pregnant as a teenager, you are less likely to get married, less likely to find someone who's going to commit to you and your child. You have baggage now. It's not just you, that's the reality. But I'm not saying you can't find someone. And by the way, a lot of it has to do with just how desirable you are. If you're good looking, there's plenty of guys who'd want you, right? But if you're average looking or whatever it is, or it's gonna be harder, okay? But it just makes life harder, okay? Teenage mothers who marry are just more likely to be abused, right? When you do get married, you're more likely to be abused, right? You're more likely to have problems with your spouse, and you're more likely to get beat up or to beat somebody up, right? You're more likely to be abandoned, right? More likely that they're going to leave you, more likely to get divorced. It just makes life harder. There's also bad consequences for the child. Before birth, there's more likely to be prenatal complications, right? Or birth complications. They're more likely to suffer from brain damage, low birth weight, things like that, right? Especially if your body's not ready for conception, for birth, right? The child's more likely to suffer mistreatment. And the reason for that is that as a teenage mother, guess what? Life is harder for you. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be angry, and you're more likely to mistreat your child. And even when you get married, you're more likely to mistreat your child, or your child's more likely to be mistreated by the person you do marry. And keep in mind that you're still young when you probably get married because you got pregnant as a teenager. We're not talking that you're going to get married when you're in your 30s or 40s, right? You're still young, and people tend to be, more problematic when they're younger, right? They're less mature. Less educational success. It's just harder to get through school. More, for the child, they're also less likely to suffer from, get less educational success. Because the mother, their parents are less likely to have gone to college themselves just because they couldn't, right? Because they became parents when they were teenagers. They have less role models, less income. All that affects education. They're more likely to use drugs, to drop out, become delinquent, and become teenage parents themselves. Okay, it's just a bad situation when you get pregnant, give birth, right? Have a child before you're ready. Before you can be responsible for that child. I've seen it a lot in my own family, right? Yeah, like I said, it used to be rare. I remember my first cousin that it happened to, female cousin of mine, and her kids are all grown up now. And then it happened again and again to others, and it happened so much. As a matter of fact, it became the norm. It's like they all got pregnant when they were teenagers. They became adolescents. They had these desires. They started having sex, and a lot of them got pregnant. They didn't protect themselves. There are a few, that waited a little bit longer, were able to hold out a little bit longer, but most of them did not. And that's the reality when you grow up poor and disadvantaged. Your parents are working all the time. There's no one watching the kids. Become adolescents. They start partying and drinking and having sex, and they get pregnant. That's what happens. Okay. There's also, more, that title at the top doesn't really fit with what is below, but there's less problems with teenage pregnancies than in earlier decades. It has gotten better. There are less teenage pregnancies now. Okay. There are some positive trends. There's been a decrease in teen births in every nation. So, it is going down. And the reason for that is because there's a rise in protection. More people now are having protected sex. More people are now using contraception. There's even been a decrease in the teen abortion rate. Yes, abortions do happen, and they're less likely to happen when people use contraception because they're less likely to get pregnant in the first place when people use protection. Now, condom use, like I said, it's kind of hit and miss, right? Less than half of these teenagers are actually using condoms, but there's other forms of contraception that don't really protect against sexually transmitted infections, but they at least protect against pregnancy, right? If you're on the pill or you get some other form of birth control, you are very unlikely, to get pregnant. And like I said before, that's why we need, to have these things in place, right? We need to have available contraception. And no teenager shouldn't have to tell their parents, or shouldn't have to ask permission from their parents to get contraception, because that just makes it that they're not going to get the contraception because they're going to be embarrassed. And teenagers will be teens, they're going to start dating. A lot of them will start having sex. And if it's hard for them to get contraception because they have to ask for permission, then you're going to have more teen births. You're going to have more abortions. And that's the reality. This is a health issue. Okay. If they're, they should be able to get these things on their own. And in many places in the US, they can. Other places are a bit more conservative and they want the parents to know and whatever it is. And that's going to be a problem. Okay, because trust me, when you're a teenager, you don't want to tell your parents you're having sex, and let alone get permission to use birth control, right? I have told in the past, when they were raising teenagers, my aunts and my uncles say, listen, you have teenagers here, right? You have teenage daughter, you have teenage kids here. They're gonna start having sex pretty soon, okay? And I told them this when their kids were about 13, around there. 14 before, right? Or even before that, even before they became teenagers, when they start puberty. And I told them, please, have that talk with your kids. Talk to them about this stuff. Tell them about contraception, right? Your daughter's 15, 14 years old. Please get your teen on some birth control. It's only a matter of time before they start having sex. Please do this before they get pregnant. It's gonna, it's very likely to happen. They're gonna start having sex. Nobody listened to me. And that's what happened. Okay. One of them at least was in college when she got pregnant. She was already like 18. She just started college, and then she didn't go back for several years. And then now she started going to college again. Now that her kids are a little bit older and they can go to school. But you have to know about this stuff, and you have to be responsible as a parent, right? When you have an adolescent, right? It's up to you when you want to start having that talk, and when you want them to be prepared. But for me, by the time they're 15 years old, maybe even a little bit earlier, I would make sure that they're aware of how to do things responsible. As a matter of fact, by 15 years of age, I would want my daughter on birth control. And that doesn't mean I'm telling her to have sex. That just means I want her to be protected. I don't want her to get pregnant when she's an adolescent and then lessen her chances of success down the road. Okay? Just because you protect your kids doesn't mean you're giving them the okay to have sex. And that's what a lot of parents worry about. A lot of people fight about. Okay? But, just be aware of the reality. Okay? Sexual abuse. There is sexual abuse that happens during adolescence. A lot of sexual abuse out there. Okay? Sexual abuse is the use of an unconsenting person for sexual pleasure. Okay, it comes in many forms, of course. From things that have to do with like rape, right, the most extreme form, or even incest, right? But also, fondling, and other things. Okay. It damages the person's ability to establish a trusting, comfortable, and intimate relationship. If you've been sexually abused, it's harder for you to trust someone. It's harder for you to get close to someone in a sexual way because somebody has taken advantage of you, right? You're very vulnerable as a teenager, right? It really shatters the illusion, right, that you had about people, that people are good and people are going to be, are going to treat you well. Every adolescent problem like delinquency, pregnancy, right, is more common in victims of sexual abuse. Those who have been sexually abused are just more likely to have those problems. They feel worse about themselves, right? They're more likely to suffer from depression and just feel really awful about themselves, low self-esteem. And because of that, they're just more likely to use drugs. They're more likely to join delinquent groups and engage in other risky behavior and end up getting pregnant or getting an STI. And here's the sad thing. Parents, mostly fathers and stepfathers, are the perpetrators in more than 50% of cases. More than half the cases of sexual abuse, we're talking about the father or the stepfather that is sexually abusing their own daughter. That is really messed up, but that's what happens most of the time. We worry about other things, strangers and things like that. And yes, those people, can be capable of doing this, right? But who has more access to the teenager? It's usually their own parents. So it's usually, their own dad, their own stepfather. It's a very sad thing, and it happens a lot. There's a lot of, especially adolescent girls that are sexually abused. Adolescent boys as well, not as common, but it happens a lot. It's a really awful thing. More about sexual abuse. Sexual victimization can begin in childhood. Kids may not even be aware that somebody's already victimizing them, right? Where they're, start fondling them and the kid doesn't even know what's happening, right? Where they're shown, nude pictures, or where the father or the stepfather or somebody else exposes themselves to them. They have no idea that there's anything wrong with that in childhood. They make suggestive comments that imply things of a sexual nature. Overt sexual abuse, so sexual abuse that is just more apparent, more obvious, that begins at puberty. 33% of adolescent girls report being victims of this sexual abuse, and 20% of them report being victims of rape. Right? That's more severe, but like I said, sexual abuse also comes in other forms. Okay, lesser than rape. Okay, but that's a lot of people. Think about it. If we just think about rape, right? 1 out of every 5 girls has been raped during adolescence, and 1 out of every 3 has been molested in some form, sexually abused. That is awful. That is how common it is. We have a lot of people out there who can't control themselves around these adolescents, these teenagers. Keep in mind, these teenagers are, they're basically, their bodies are changing and they're turning into adults, and they become more attractive, more appealing to other adults as well. And some of them take advantage of them. Adolescent boys can also be victims of sexual abuse. Okay. Not as often as girls, but it does happen. I don't have any numbers for you, but if I had to guess, it might be 1 in 10 maybe 1 in 20. It's less common. I don't remember the statistic exactly, but it's a lot less common than girls, but it still happens quite a bit. Okay, they're more likely to. The harm, by the way, is worse. They feel even worse about themselves if their own if the abuser is their own father, which is often the case, or if they're gay, right? If they're gay and their own father abuses them, somebody abuses them, then they feel even worse. They feel shame, they feel vulnerable, they feel awful about themselves. And this is just something that shouldn't happen, but it happens a lot because sexual urges are very strong, especially, even in adults. And some of them, when they have these teenage girls in the house, right? Or they have these, or even teenage boys, right? Less often with boys, but, they can't control themselves, or they do things that they know are wrong. And, it's a very sad thing, but it happens a lot. Okay. Sex trafficking, last thing here, sex trafficking is a problem. We don't know how common it is. Estimates in the United States range from, there might be as many 1,000 to as many as 336,000 victims of sex trafficking. Remember that there is prostitution out there, and that there's even people who are underage that are forced into prostitution or abducted and taken to other countries and become victims of sex trafficking. We just don't know how common this is, but it is a problem. Okay, could this happen to someone in your community? Yes, it can. It can happen anywhere, even in communities where you wouldn't expect. You might think you're in a nice community, right? That's safe. And there you are as an adolescent girl, or even as even maybe someone who's a little bit older, right? Jogging, thinking you're safe. And then a van pulls up next to you and somebody comes out of the van and shoves you into the van. And then they, off you go. And you might end up being forced into prostitution or smuggled into another country. That happens probably more in other countries than in the US, but it does happen here too. There are people who are smuggled actually from other countries into the US and forced into prostitution. And we just don't know how many victims there are. It's a very sad thing, and it's happened to people. Some people don't even realize that they're actually victims of this. There are some people who are who get involved with with prostitution and don't even know it, where they're basically fooled into being that. I mean, they are hired like for a job basically, and they say, oh, all you have to do is go on dates with people, and if you want to have sex with them, that's up to you. And they don't even realize that they do this, right? And that they have become prostitutes. They don't even know this, but it happens, and we don't know just how often it does. That is where we'll stop.